All right, so we're continuing with part 3 of our, force of habit. We're continuing with part 3 of our medical ethics class, and so I left off with the beginning of life issues, right? And for some reason I have a feeling like I'm going to forget something really big in this video, but I feel like there's something I'm supposed to be saying and I can't remember what it was. But anyways, I'm just going to keep moving through the material, and again, if you have questions that come up, feel free to be able to ask me those questions, okay? All right, so a lot of the beginning of life issues has to do with contraception and abortion or abortifacients, right? So we've been talking a lot about contraception and abortifacients. I'm going to start talking about a couple other issues, right? So just the issue in general of abortion. And so an abortion is where it is directly intended to end the life of a baby. Now, whether that's very early on in the pregnancy, halfway through the pregnancy, or very late in the pregnancy, all of these where it's directly intended to end the life of the child, that is abortion, okay? That is never, ever permissible. It is never justifiable. That falls under the absolute principle of it is never, ever permissible to take the life of an innocent human being, to intentionally take the life of an innocent human being. Okay? All right. Now, we just put that out there. There's just no getting around that one. Okay? We can't kill, no matter what the circumstances are, when it's involved in innocent human life. All right. Ectopic pregnancies. Okay, so an ectopic pregnancy, this is when the egg and the sperm unite and fertilize to become an embryo when it's still in the fallopian tube, or sometimes in other locations. I'm not exactly sure how all that happens when it's other locations, but apparently it's been known to happen in the abdomen or in other places, okay? Normally this is in the fallopian tube. So this is not in the uterus. So what happens in the tube, the embryo implants itself in the tube and then begins to grow, which, if you think about it, is absolutely remarkable that can actually happen. I mean, a life is amazing, but in this circumstance, it's dangerous. So here's a couple facts to keep in mind when somebody comes to you and asks, what can they do? What is permissible in the church's teachings for them to do with regards to an ectopic pregnancy? Okay? Now, most ectopic pregnancies actually resolve themselves. So they just naturally resolve themselves. Because it's not normal, because it's not natural for the baby to exist there, generally speaking, the body itself would end up pushing the embryo out, okay? And so there's no fault there of anybody's, it's just usually they resolve themselves, okay? Now, in those circumstances when they don't, it becomes very dangerous because it could actually cause the death of the mother if the baby were to be left there and then the baby keeps growing, eventually bursting the fallopian tube, right? Okay. There are 3 normal methods of handling an ectopic pregnancy. When I took this class, one of them was absolutely not permitted. One was being discussed because it wasn't quite sure exactly what it did. And then the third was considered permissible. Okay? So the one that's considered permissible is where there would be a physical operation done on the mother. The fallopian tube would be cut before the embryo and before the embryo and after the embryo, and then that section of the tube would be removed, and then the tube would be reconnected. Now, the consequence of that, realistic consequence of that, is usually that tube is no longer functioning per se, and so it's more difficult for the mother to get pregnant after that procedure is done. Sometimes it's fine, but other times it hinders pregnancy in that one fallopian tube, because there are two, right? So the moral reasoning behind the acceptability of that procedure is that it's the principle of double effect. They're removing the tube, which is diseased, which is it is not functioning the way it should be functioning because it's blocked, right? And it's a danger to the life of the mother. And so they remove that section of the tube. Now, this does result in the baby dying, but it is not intended. And if there was a way for us to re-implant that embryo in the uterus or somewhere else, it would be expected that that would be done, but there are no procedures for that at this time. When I took the class, a question was asked, well, why not? And the person giving the class said, well, because there's no money in it. In other words, they don't research things when there's no money. They only research when there's potential for profit. So, hence, the difficulties that we as Christians and Catholics have in the medical field when it is driven by profit. I think he said there was one known case where they believe that re-implanting the embryo into the uterus actually worked, and it was like in the 1800s. And so they said back then their documentation was not such that they could actually verify that it was the same embryo. Okay, all right. So the second procedure, which is questionable, but I think that's been resolved as being non-acceptable, but again, you would have to pursue that one a little bit more. And that's where they administer a drug that then dissolves the embryo. The moral question on this is, does it dissolve the embryo itself? In other words, it attacks the child, or does it dissolve the connection, the lining of the fallopian tube, and preserves the integrity of the child, but the child is thus then sent down the tube? In which case they would consider that under the principle of double effect, I believe. But they're pretty sure that basically the chemicals attack the baby, and they would consider that to be unacceptable, okay? The third procedure is where it's also a form of surgery where they go in and they slit the fallopian tube, and then they just blast the embryo out with a water jet. And that's considered unacceptable because it's directly attacking the embryo. Okay? So when you get more and more into some of these issues, it gets difficult. Even experts have trouble really applying some of our basic principles to these situations because we don't necessarily know exactly how all of the chemicals work and everything, but the most acceptable form is the cutting of the tube before the embryo and after the embryo, and then removing that section of the tube. Okay? All right. I wanted to add that in all of these procedures, because the baby's dying, none of them are necessarily considered good, but there are some that are considered justifiable under the circumstances. Or in this case, the one where they cut before and after is considered justifiable. I apologize, I don't remember the names of those procedures, but you can look them up, okay? All right. So in this, we're applying basic principles. We cannot intentionally attack the embryo or destroy the embryo. That cannot be the treatment, is to attack the embryo, all right? Okay. I want to talk about cases of rape where, let's say a young lady goes into the hospital. She's just been a victim of a rape. What is considered acceptable in terms of treatment? It is considered acceptable in the hospital. Let's say the woman goes in, immediately after the rape. It is considered that that woman can protect herself from conception, because this is not a situation which was consensual. This is an attack on her body. This was an attack, and therefore she has the right to protect herself from, if there's sperm that was in it, she has the right to protect herself from that. Okay, and so there are medical procedures. There's ways of doing that. Now, the only time in the Catholic Church we would say that something is not permissible is if they give her like Plan B, or they give her something that is an abortifacient, right? So something that would attack the embryo after conception. And so in those circumstances, we say we do not do that, okay? But for her to be able to prevent conception using an acceptable method that only addresses the conception and that is not an abortifacient is considered permissible in those circumstances, okay? I want to go back a little bit to contraception, and I want to talk about, because you will have conversations with people where this issue is in some ways harder than even the abortion issue. The abortion issue, more and more people, and it's proven even with young people, more and more people really recognize the evil of abortion, that it's just murder. There's just no way of getting around it, right? And medical science has proven it. Anyone who does any level of research into it can show that a child is dying in an abortion, all right? But contraception is a moral issue that is more difficult. It's often said 80% of Catholics are using or have used contraception or sterilization. And so this is an issue where I don't think we've adequately taught our people and brought them to a place where they really understand it. So I want to talk about it a little bit. Contraception, in principle, became much more used, much more acceptable just in the last 100 years. In fact, it's almost been exactly 100 years, since the 1920s, when it was really starting to be promoted and even considered acceptable by other Christian denominations. Since that time, they've tracked, often statistically, other issues, other things like divorce. And they found that the rate of divorce was almost exactly the rate of contraceptive usage. And the connection between contraceptive usage and divorce has been established. They've done studies where they found that couples that are using contraception of some type have a divorce rate between 40 to 50%, which that's a number we've often heard that's just standard for the United States, right? Couples that do not use contraception, so this would be natural family planning, or just, they're not even planning, they're just not using contraception, right? Couples that do not use contraception have a divorce rate between 2 and 8%. It depends which study you look at, but the highest study said 8%, the lowest study said 2%. That is substantially different. The divorce rate for couples not using contraception is between 2% and 8%. Now, I suppose there's different reasons for that, right? I want to offer some thoughts as to why something like natural family planning, the use of natural family planning, which is considered acceptable for us as Catholics, has such a different effect on the marriage as contraception. So when a couple begins to use contraception, it begins to undermine, if you will, many of the foundational pieces of a relationship. So it is considered acceptable to engage in sexual relations now before a couple's even married, right? It's normal now, pretty much. And anyone who does marriage preparation realizes that it's actually kind of rare when you have a couple that's not sexually active. Part of that is because of birth control. So you ask the couple, as priests in confession, people will bring this up, and you start talking to them about why they're using contraception, and they say, well, we're not ready to have children. We're not thinking about having children right now. And so what it does is it begins to change the purpose of the sexual relationship. It's not about being open to life. It's not about creating life. Even though the whole biological purpose of sex is to bring the sperm together with the egg, they want to reject that completely. And so the whole biological purpose of the sexual relationship is to create another human being. It is to participate in God's act of creation, is to be co-creators with God. But a couple that says, no, that's not what we want, then the whole sexual relationship becomes a lie. It's a form of deception. It's saying we are engaging in an act that normally would require a man and a woman to commit their lives to each other for the rest of their lives, right? And to desire to create life, but we're going to engage in that act, but we're not going to want any of that fruit or any of that responsibility. And so it undermines the whole purpose, if you will, of the sexual relationship. So now imagine a couple that builds that relationship on that lie. The other reason I think that it's very detrimental to a relationship is they have found that couples that begin to be sexually active very early on never really develop communication skills, at least on the same level as a couple that abstains from sexual relations early on in the relationship. So when couples come to me seeking marriage preparation and they're already sexually active, I require them to sign a promise where they are no longer going to be sexually active. They have to go to confession, right? And then they have to be faithful to that. And I tell them it's because I need for them to reset their relationship so that it can reform more naturally, where the sexual relationship is not blurring everything, because that's proper for marriage. That's proper for after you've consented and after you've asked God to bless you in marriage, but not before. And I have to say, I never regretted it. I will never go back to not expecting that. I watch couples take their marriage preparation far more seriously after they've made that promise. And so by them being sexually active, it undermines the basic formation that needs to happen, and also the freedom that needs to be there so that they can look at the relationship and say, you know what, this isn't working. This is not healthy, right? Whereas if they're sexually active, or if they've already had a child or two, they're already now, if you will, obligated to the relationship, even though it never formed in a healthy or natural way. Hence, all those things happening, divorce becomes more common because the relationship never formed the way it should have. The other component to this is that when a couple begins to use contraception, there is no necessity for communication with regards to the sexual activity because there's no fruit being born. It would be like planting a tree, a fruit tree that you know is never going to bear fruit, so you would never have to worry about it bearing fruit. So you just water it, but there's no purpose to it, right? And so the fact that there's no need for communication means oftentimes that the dignity of the woman is undermined. Because oftentimes the man will begin to look at the woman only in terms of the physical pleasure. Or the woman only looks at the man in terms of the physical pleasure from the sexual relationship. But that doesn't, there's no need for marriage in that, in lifelong relationship in that. And so the sexual relationship has been hollowed out, it's been emptied of any real meaning. So when that happens, there's this natural side of the man and of the woman to feel this emptiness, and an emptiness in the marriage. So what do they often do? They fill it with other things. They fill it with jobs and the rat race and making more money and buying a bigger house and more things and better vacations, and none of that is really necessarily natural. That's not what God intended. So those are a couple thoughts just with regards to the destructive nature of contraception. Now, natural family planning, if you're not familiar with it, I need for you to just go and to begin to research and to learn about it, because I'm not going to go into it a whole lot today. Natural family planning is the ability of the woman to look at the natural cycle, the natural rhythm of her body, her fertility cycle, using some science to determine when she's fertile and when she's not fertile, and then from that, as a couple, communicate together and decide whether or not they're going to be having sexual relations when they're fertile or when they're just not fertile. Okay? Now, it is expected that the couple not put off or not forgo having sexual relations when they're fertile for selfish reasons. This is not to be used just for selfish reasons. This is to be used for absolutely for serious reasons, like when there's health issues, when there are serious issues going on in the marriage, that it's considered acceptable to use. But not necessarily just for selfish reasons, okay? But it is a method that is considered acceptable. Now, sometimes people will say, oh yeah, my mom did that and it never worked. The methods that they use now are far more effective than they were used, let's say, 30 years ago. So there's a method in which the woman would use the temperature of her body to know whether or not, or where she's at in her cycle, okay? And so that is one method. So using the temperature of her body, so she has to take her temperature and she has to know how to track that. So there are programs out there. The Couple-to-Couple League has a lot of information in Spanish and in English, the Couple-to-Couple League. In fact, they may have information in other languages as well. They have a website, I think it's CCLI, I'm not sure, something like that. But you can look up the Couple-to-Couple League. They have great information. And it's finding teachers who can come in then and teach this. As deacons, as married deacons, though, this might be an ideal ministry for you and your wife to take up for the parish. I have found that more and more people who are interested in natural family planning are not just Catholics, but the people who are rejecting this lie about women pumping all these really toxic chemicals into their body just to keep them infertile for many years, right? And so it's just a horrible thing. So they want to live more naturally. So more people are looking into natural family planning. Okay? The other positive side effect of natural family planning is it intrinsically respects the dignity of the woman. She's the one in control, and the husband has to be on board, and there has to be really good communication in order to make it work. And I think that builds the marriage and makes it stronger, right? It also keeps in the forefront, because it's always part of the conversation about sexual relations, is fertility and conceiving of a child. And that's healthy, that's normal, okay? All right. Oh, the other thing about it is just, the thing is that it requires faith. I mean, you have to have faith. You have to have faith in your spouse, but you also have to have faith in God. And, so many of the things that we bring into our lives these days is to make it so that we don't need to trust God, right? So whether trusting God with our fertility, with the fertility of the couple, whether trusting God with our finances, trusting God with our job, our education, our property. I mean, all these things, it's like more and more we're so in control of things that we don't actually need to live by faith. And that serves no purpose, right? That means we just kind of waste our lives. So to look for ways where we say, no, I trust God on this, okay? So by using natural family planning, by using more communication, by making the harder path, taking the harder path, it actually really does serve the purpose of demonstrating and living by faith, okay? I'm going to talk about a couple other issues real quick here. So artificial insemination. So the ways in which couples may artificially seek to conceive of a child. Now, sometimes people say, well, why does the Catholic Church oppose that when they're so focused on fertility, right? They're against birth control. So why would they be against artificial fertilization, right? And the reason is because we're not just for fertility, we are for protecting the integrity of the true purpose of the sexual relationship, right? It is meant to communicate marital love. It is meant to be open to fertility, to open to the creation of new life, open to conception, right? Procreation, as we say. And it has to be open to both of those. And it cannot, therefore, be taken, the conception, the fertility or procreation can't be removed from the marital relationship, okay? They have to be together. So artificial insemination is a technique in which they would take the sperm from the man and then insert it into the woman's body without the man necessarily doing that, right? So there's a doctor involved or something along those lines. And so that is not permissible because it is removing the act of conception from the act of the marital sexual relationship, okay? So that is unacceptable. We cannot do that. That is sinful, okay? In vitro fertilization is another technique that sometimes couples will use at fertility clinics. And so what they do is they take the eggs from the woman, they take the sperm from the man, and then in a petri dish, they bring them together. Now, this results in often many of the embryos that are fertilized in the dish to be aborted because they don't use all of them. They only look for the strongest ones, right? The ones they think that will survive. And so that's so un-Christian. It's like a survival of the fittest, right? Can you imagine a married couple having children and saying, well, he's the weak one, so let's just get rid of him? It's so un-Christian to do that, okay? We develop all kinds of ethical issues when we start doing these things because they start freezing embryos that the couple may want to use years down the line. But then what if they don't? Well, now we have human life there. You're just going to destroy it? So all kinds of ethical issues there. Okay, if you take the class, this ethics class through the National Catholic Bioethics Center, they talk a lot about this issue, about whether or not we can rescue, if you will, those embryos. All kinds of issues there, but it's very complicated. So we do not permit in vitro fertilization because, again, it removes the act of fertilization, the act of conception, from the marital sexual act. Okay? Now, what that means is that there are methods that are considered acceptable as long as, again, it requires a natural sexual relationship between the man and the woman, okay? I'm not going to go into all the other consequences of this artificial forms of fertilization because it's creating all kinds of issues. They're using people who are not even part of that relationship to offer their sperm or their eggs. You have women who are now acting as carriers, if you will, or surrogate mothers. That is not considered acceptable because all of those things separate They separate the natural sexual relationship from the act of conception. Okay? All right. We are going to move on now to end-of-life issues, okay? So we're going to talk about end-of-life stuff. So we're in the last section here. Okay. Should I repeat myself one more time? It is never, ever permissible to intentionally kill an innocent human life. Okay? So this applies to end-of-life issues. It applies to any circumstance where somebody's life is maybe considered, or somebody may have considered to have less quality of life, right? Adolf Hitler was one of the pioneers into mercy killing, into killing out of compassion. And so he would apply that to people with mental illness. He would apply it to people with health deformities or mental retardation, or people with just issues considered undesirable. He would later apply it to people with different types of behavior issues, and he would apply it to people of different religions, and all of this is wrong. It is never ever permissible to intentionally kill an innocent human life. Okay? In the medical ethics, what that means is it's never permissible to administer treatment that would intentionally end the life of a person. Okay? So the treatment that we're providing is to intentionally end their life. It is also never permissible to withhold ordinary treatment, from a person in order to intentionally end their life or to hasten the end of their life. Okay? One of the ones that was very controversial a while back was when Pope John Paul II came out and said that should be now considered ordinary treatment to provide nutrition and hydration. So that would be an IV to provide hydration or a feeding tube to provide nutrition. Now, what we're talking about when we say ordinary treatment is that it benefits the person, right? So remember benefit and burden? It benefits the person. The treatment actually does what it's meant to do to help the body remain as healthy as possible, right? So it benefits the person and is not an undue burden on the person or the hospital or whatever the circumstances may be. And we're speaking, though, of the treatment, okay? Now, there comes a point where the human body just begins to shut down, no matter what you do. It is not considered, nutrition and hydration is not considered ordinary care when the burden becomes greater than the benefit. In other words, it's not benefiting the body at all. In fact, it begins to harm the body. So if the kidneys shut down, if the body's no longer digesting nutrients, and if we keep putting more in there, then the body just starts to retain the fluids and it actually begins to harm the person. So there's a point when a person's body begins to shut down naturally, and then it's acceptable to remove those things. Okay? So we are required to administer ordinary forms of treatment. Nutrition and hydration is considered ordinary when they benefit the natural operations of the body. So in nursing homes, it is actually fairly common for the family to say, we're just going to stop feeding this person. So let's say in the Alzheimer's unit, this happens frequently. In the memory care units, the person is, let's say, on getting to the point where they can no longer feed themselves, and so the family says, well, we don't want a feeding tube put in them. Well, the person, let's say, is not dying. They need the nutrients, they need the nutrition, and to not provide it as an ordinary form of care means that person is going to die without them. Okay? So that's not a situation where the body's shutting down per se. They're just not able to feed themselves in that moment or in that time. Okay? So it'd be considered mandatory to provide it as ordinary care, as long as their body can process the nutrition and the hydration. Okay? All right. So withholding treatment, the only time it is permissible to withhold treatment is when it's considered extraordinary care. So let's say, for example, a person has been determined to be brain dead. They're on a ventilator, so machines are keeping the organs functioning. But there's a point where the doctor says to the family, I think we need to discuss perhaps turning off the ventilator to see whether or not they can breathe on their own, right? And so those are very, very difficult moments, very difficult decisions to be made. But it is considered acceptable that in those moments the treatment is considered extraordinary. In other words, the person cannot survive without it, and it's not necessarily ordinary treatment, right? Okay, so we're not talking about food and hydration, but so there reaches a point where we say it's acceptable to let the person die naturally. Okay? All right. I want to mention something at this time about this. Sometimes in the hospital, the family is simply not ready to make that decision. They're not ready to stop the treatment that the person is receiving. And let's say it's a situation where it's considered acceptable to do so, right? But the family's just not ready. I always tell a family, look, you don't have to make the decision today. And they say, well, the hospital's putting pressure on us. You say, you don't have to make that decision today. Just tell them, we want you just to maintain what you're doing at this time, okay? Now, if that treatment is actually harming the person, then the hospital's free to stop that treatment. But let's say it's a situation where they're providing a ventilator or, I'm forgetting the name, but they're providing care for the person. Let's say the hospital's saying the person is now brain dead. You tell the family, hey, you can wait till tomorrow. You can wait 2 or 3 days, right? Let the hospital sweat it out. You can keep the person. I think it's very beneficial to the pastoral care of the family to wait until they're ready to make the decision. From my experience, I have found families are generally ready to make the decision within 2 or 3 days. Okay? Now, sometimes you have situations where one family member is just not handling it well. Maybe they're emotionally just really struggling. But by and large, you can tell when the family's ready. Okay? So I really hesitate ever to push the family to make a decision when they're not ready to make it. All right? Okay. I think that's important. Because sometimes hospitals, they're thinking not about the patient, but they're thinking about getting that bed open to bring in more people into the hospital because they have pressure. They have to, there's people waiting to get in, right? So, yeah. Okay. I mentioned one example already, this idea of this voluntary assisted fasting, where they actually provide medication so the person can just not eat anything and not feel the pain of it. That's a form of assisted suicide. Any form of assisted suicide for any reason is obviously violating our basic principle that we've mentioned before. Okay, one of the things that they found with assisted suicide is that by and large, the person is struggling from depression. The person feels like they are a burden to their family. And so they've been robbed of their dignity because they feel like they become a burden to others. Sometimes it's just issues of pride. It's like, I'm not gonna live this way. I'm not gonna have that kind of quality of life, right? So pride, okay? And also families, Families will say, well, I don't want the person to suffer. And you say, okay, but really, if you talk to them about it, really what they don't want is they don't want to watch the person suffer. It's more about them than it is about the person. There is no concept in this conversation so far of this, what's happened here, where suffering is actually redemptive. It's participating in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And also it can be turning that suffering into an act of love for others. So for us as Christians, there's just so much meaning in these moments, in these last moments of a person's life, or in these really difficult situations. There's so much opportunity for fruit to come from it. But if we don't believe that, and if we're not living by faith in that, then it'll never happen. It'll never bear fruit. I would also say that faith is necessary where we trust God in these difficult situations, where we don't violate our moral teachings, and we trust that God is at work. Right? Okay. A couple other concepts to take into account. So palliative care is where we are allowed to treat the pain. We are allowed to administer medication and do things to alleviate the suffering of the person. It is not considered ideal to just medicate a person to the point where they become unconscious, because ideally, the person should be conscious in their last moments of their life. They should have that freedom to be conscious. If they can't be, because the pain is so severe, then we medicate, we provide treatment so that the person is not living in unnecessary or unreasonable amounts of pain, right? And so that's considered acceptable. There's a line, right, if you've ever worked with hospice care, where to make sure that they're not just over-medicating. They're not just putting the person out, right? So they're just unconscious. The other thing is sometimes, and I've seen this, where they will medicate, they will provide so much morphine that it actually really and truly does hasten the death of the person. They basically kill the person with the morphine. Now, I want to also differentiate this between providing palliative care, so care that addresses the pain, where it is considered acceptable to provide enough medication that addresses the pain and may, as a secondary effect, hasten the death of that person, but it is not intended. Okay? So, one of the ways that my teacher taught us this, he says that it looks like it's hastening the person's death, but he says in reality it's not. Because when a person is in severe pain, they're going to die much faster than if you begin to treat the pain. And so even though it may look like when you give the person the morphine, it looks like maybe it's hastening, but it's really not. It's actually prolonging that person's life. Okay? So I thought that was an interesting observation. But we can never use that palliative care to intentionally hasten that person's death. Okay? I want to talk just for a moment about what's called PVS, the permanent vegetative state. This is where a person is permanently not conscious or they are not responsive, but they are alive. And they only need ordinary means of care to stay alive, right? Maybe they need nutrition and hydration, but that's all they need. They don't need a ventilator. They don't need other forms of medication. They can live perfectly fine in a care home or even at home as long as they're getting the ordinary means of care. We consider that a person in that situation has the same dignity and the same rights as people of any other condition, okay? We do not have the right to withhold ordinary care from them. And so when we see it become really controversial in the press, we do fight for the life of that person if something's being done, if some ordinary means of care is being withheld, or there's things being done to hasten their death. Okay? I want to offer a thought on this too. If people say, well, they don't have quality of life, I would argue that. I would say, I think God allows these situations not to test them, not to test the patient, but to test us. To see whether or not we will stretch our hearts to care for that person as long as necessary. That person has the dignity and the ability to receive love and to give love. Okay? Maybe they can't give it in a physical way, but spiritually speaking, maybe little things, emotionally speaking, they can communicate love, but they can definitely receive love. Now, if you've ever been in the hospital, we know this, that a person can often hear, can listen and understand when they can't do anything else. They can't respond in any other way. And so I've actually had instances of this where the person seemed to be comatose, and we were having a conversation, and later when they were out of it, they could repeat what we were saying from that conversation. So maybe that's not necessarily comatose. I think that more they were seemingly unconscious, right? But they could still hear and understand. And so for us to really to be able to give them the benefit of the doubt and to say, okay, we always provide ordinary means of care, and we love them, right? We treat them as we would any other human being, and we love them. And just again, bringing kind of this idea to full, it's good to have a good, durable power of attorney. So if somebody comes to you and says, hey, what do I do? Should I have a living will? Should I have an advanced care directive? To really encourage people to have a durable power of attorney. And what that is they select someone to act on their behalf should they become incapacitated. And someone they trust, and they make their wishes known to them, say, I want you to respect the Catholic Church's teachings on any decisions you make in terms of my care, right? Okay, so that's one thing we want to encourage people. I want to talk about, also just organ donation. This is an issue because sometimes there's problems with regards to how our medical community defines death, okay? Sometimes they have found that the way they're defining death is not actually really death. And the reason for that is because they're, in a sense, trying to hasten the process of being able to harvest the organs. Okay? And I don't have the knowledge or the expertise to go into much detail, other than to say, if you're working with a family and something just doesn't seem to be quite right, to know that there have been some issues with this. Now, if you go to the National Catholic Bioethics Center website or you ask for some information on this, they have information, much more information on this if you ever are concerned about it. We consider organ donation to be a good thing. As Catholics, it's an act of charity for someone who can use that organ. It is only permitted, obviously, when it doesn't do harm to the natural operations of the body of the donor. Okay? So if somebody can't donate organs when it's going to harm their ability to survive or to function. The other thing is considered always unacceptable to sell organs. And I think that's understood. But more and more where medical field is profit-driven, I think we're going to have issues with that. But it's never acceptable to sell one's organs, even if it's a situation where their health is not being compromised. All right? Okay. The last thing I wanted to just talk about is this term we use called to mutilize the body, mutilization. Okay? This is kind of a rarer thing, but it is something that's been happening where, let's say, parents are caring for a child who has severe disabilities, maybe they're even in the permanent vegetative state, where they will actually have parts of the body removed in order to keep that person so that they don't grow to have a full-size body. So they'll actually remove parts of the body that are part of the natural growth cycle so that the person will permanently stay small. And so they would justify it by saying, by keeping that person's body small, like the size of a child, they can therefore care for that person in their home much better. It sounds really weird, but there's actually people who are doing this where they will surgically remove sometimes sexual organs and things like that. Now, one of the other reasons for this is the removing of sexual organs is there's this fear that because they're in a permanent vegetative state, if they were in an institution and they were to be raped, they could become pregnant, right? In the case of a young lady. And so they would remove their sexual organs so that they could never be raped. And for us, we're like, whoa, wait a minute, this is so bizarre, right? Let's deal with the issue. The issue is you have a fear in this institution that your loved one is going to be raped. And you're going to put them in that institution, right? And so that's not acceptable. We deal with the issue at hand, which is the threat of sexual assault of someone in an institution, right? But we don't mutilate their body because of our fears where somebody may commit a sexual assault. The other thing is, if we go around permanently sterilizing people because of their condition, because they're in an institution, that only invites sexual assault. It only makes it more inviting to somebody who may be really, really dysfunctional, really screwed up, right? So we don't necessarily want to harm, mutilate the body of the innocent person so that if there is a person who's doing really obscene things to these people, that they can just kind of get away with it. Absolutely not, right? So these are situations that are a little less common. Perhaps they'll become more common if in the future when maybe people start proposing that, you know, everybody who's permanently admitted to a mental hospital be sterilized. You know, who knows what the future holds? But we always, again, we step back. You can never, ever do something to the body that's functioning naturally and then destroy that natural function. So the thing that is common is sterilization. If the reproductive system of the body is functioning normally, we cannot mutilate it. We can't just stop it from working, okay? Nor can we definitely ever do that for people who are more vulnerable. So, all right. I think I covered pretty much everything I want to cover, and there is so much more and so much more detail and more depth to these things. Hopefully I did at least some level of justice, and you have a sense of some of these issues, okay? All right, I'm going to end here. We're just going to end with a prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We're going to entrust this all over to Our Lady, and that whenever we're in situations where we're being asked to provide wisdom or guidance or counsel, that we always turn to you, Lord, and through the intercession of Our Lady, and be able to help these people through these situations with pastoral care. And so we say, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. All right, God bless you all, and I'll see you in the Zoom session when we do that. All right.